Hello there, neighbors. Just a quick mention before we jump into the episode. I've been posting a lot more short-form content on TikTok and Instagram. So if you would be so kind, stop on over to either of those platforms and check it out. It's in the same vein as the things that I talk about on the podcast. Once in a while, there's some content there that's a little bit more lighthearted and comedic than the podcast itself, but I think you'll enjoy it. And if you do, please like, follow, and comment if you would. Alrighty then, let's move on to the episode. I get asked quite frequently why I dislike Donald Trump so much. And I sometimes think that people expect some simple answer, like because he's a Republican. That's not it at all. Because I disagree with his tax policy. Well, I do, but that's not really it. Because I don't like his position on immigration. I don't, but that's not it. Because I think his tariffs are ridiculous. They are. But that's not it. Because he says ugly things. Because he makes politics feel like somebody spilled energy drinks all over, a leaf blower. And yeah, sure, these things bother me, and there are policies, most of his policies that I disagree with. I despise the lies. There are decisions he has made that I think have done real damage to real people. And that's all part of it, but that's not the main answer. I could have said some of the same things about various past presidents who I didn't have this level of disdain for as I do for Trump. The main answer, the number one answer, is this. I think one of the most destructive and sickening parts of Donald Trump's influence is that he has changed what millions of Americans believe is acceptable behavior. Not just acceptable policy, acceptable behavior. And there's a difference. Because now we live in a country where people scream racist abuse in grocery stores and parking lots and restaurants and airplanes like they're auditioning for some reality show called The Worst Person in the Country. We live in a country where election workers get threatened because a defeated politician couldn't admit that he lost. We live in a country where judges are called traitors and prosecutors are treated like enemies of the state, and public servants need security because they did their jobs. We live in a country where people celebrate deportation videos like they're sports highlights. We live in a country where cruelty is not just tolerated. It's packaged and clipped and posted and shared and monetized and, applauded. And no, I'm not saying that Trump invented racism. Of course not. I'm not saying he invented cruelty. I'm not saying he invented conspiracy theories and political violence or the American tradition of somebody yelling the wrong thing with the confidence of a man who, just won a fight. Those things were already here, but Trump gave many people permission to say the ugly thing out loud, permission to laugh at people suffering, permission to threaten people, permission to dehumanize people, permission to stop pretending that decency matters. And that's what this episode is about. Not just Trump, not just MAGA, but what happens when powerful people teach ordinary people that the worst versions of themselves are not something that should be restrained, that it should be something to perform. Hello, neighbors. Happy Monday, and welcome to Your Neighbor on the Left, the podcast where we talk about progressive politics, human decency, and life on the blue side of America's ideological divide. My name is Don Spielis, and I am your host. And today we're talking about permission. Not permission in the legal sense, not a signed note from the office that lets you go on a field trip to the museum. I mean cultural permission. The kind that tells people what they can get away with, what they can say, who they can mock, what cruelty they can excuse, what threats they can minimize, what racism they can pretend is, harmless or just a question. This is not going to be a sociology lecture. Nobody needs tweed elbow patches for this one. This is about everyday behavior and how politics can make ugly behavior feel safe. Permission is not the same thing as persuasion. And that distinction matters because when we talk about extremism or cruelty or racism or political threats, people sometimes imagine this cartoon version of how it works. Like one day a perfectly decent person is sitting at the kitchen table, eating toast and minding their own business, and then somebody gives one speech and suddenly that person is ready to scream at a school board member like the superintendent personally stole their lawnmower. That's usually not how it happens. Most people are not persuaded from scratch to become the worst version of themselves. A lot of the time, the ugliness was already there. Maybe it was quiet. Maybe it was private. Perhaps it only came out, after several beers and, a select audience. Maybe it lived in jokes that people pretended were just harmless jokes. Maybe it lived in the sentence that starts with, "I'm not a racist, but..." Maybe it lived in the way somebody talked about those people when those people were not there. Permission doesn't create the impulse. Permission tells the impulse it's safe to come outside. And we all understand this because we have seen it in regular life too many times. If a boss laughs at crude jokes in the office, people learn something. They learn the rules are not really the rules. They learn what's tolerated. They learn who is protected and who isn't. If a parent watches one kid bully another and doesn't do anything about it, the bully learns something. The kid being bullied learns something too. And so does everybody who's watching. If there's one person at a family dinner and they say something cruel and everyone just stares at their mashed potatoes like, they suddenly became super fascinating, that room has learned something. All these things teach. Silence teaches, laughter teaches, excuses teach, and politics teaches too. When a powerful person mocks someone and the crowd laughs, that teaches. When a powerful person lies and his supporters call it, strategy or brilliance or whatever, that teaches. When a powerful person threatens his opponents and elected officials pretend that it didn't happen, that teaches. When a person in power degrades immigrants or women, disabled people, journalists, judges, prosecutors, election workers, anyone else who gets in that politician's way, and millions of people respond by cheering or defending or minimizing or changing the subject, that teaches. It teaches people that the old rules are gone, or at the very least, they are negotiable. It teaches them that decency is optional if your side is winning. That is the permission structure. It's not always a direct order. It's not someone saying, go do this. Sometimes it's much more subtle than that. Sometimes it's just simply, I will say it and you will laugh. Sometimes it is, I will cross the line and you will move the line for me. Sometimes it's, I'm going to do the ugly thing and you're going to explain why it's really not ugly. That's why this matters, because you do not have to do the thing to give the thing permission. You do not have to scream at the election worker to give permission to the people who do. You don't have to say the slur to give permission to the person who wants to say the slur. You don't have to personally threaten a judge to help create an atmosphere where judges get threatened. At some point, what you excuse becomes part of what you support. And that is where Trump's influence is so incredibly poisonous. As I said, Trump did not create the ugliness. I'm going to say that clearly, because if I don't, somebody's going to spend time arguing with a point that I'm not making. America had racism long before Donald Trump came down that stupid escalator. America had conspiracy theories before Donald Trump discovered that saying wild nonsense on television could get him more attention than telling the truth. America had cruelty and political extremism. America had people who wanted a strong man more than they wanted a leader. America had people who thought empathy was weakness. People who thought diversity was theft and democracy was only legitimate if their side was winning. None of that started in 2015. The termites were already in the walls. What Trump did was hand them tiny little hard hats and call it a movement. He didn't create the ugliness, but he helped remove the shame. That's the difference. Before Trump, a lot of this stuff still existed, but people often understood, had grown to understood over the years, that there was a social cost to saying it out loud. Not always, not everywhere, but enough that some people knew they had to at least dress it up. They had to whisper, they had to code it, they had to pretend their contempt was concerned. They had to say, I'm just asking questions, when what they really meant was, I would like to say the thing, but I still want plausible deniability. And, another invitation to Thanksgiving. Trump blew through that like a man driving golf balls through a glass pane. He modeled contempt as a political style. Not disagreement, contempt. They're not the same thing. Disagreement says, I think you're wrong. Contempt says, you are beneath me. And Trump's politics has always been soaked in contempt. The nicknames, the mocking, the public humiliation, the way every disagreement becomes a personal attack, the way every critic becomes corrupt, the way every opponent is described as evil, the way every institution that doesn't bend to him is considered illegitimate. He turned politics into some weird dominance ritual. Who can be humiliated? Who can be downgraded? Who can be made small to get laughs from the crowd? And, I'm not diagnosing him. I'm not sitting here with the clipboard and a fake office plant pretending that I'm his therapist or his psychologist. I'm just talking about observable behavior. We all saw it. We saw him mock a disabled reporter. We saw him insult women's appearances. We saw him call immigrants animals and invaders. We saw him encourage rage at the press. We still see him demand loyalty like he's running a private kingdom instead of a constitutional government. And maybe most importantly, his supporters see all of this too. They've just decided it doesn't matter. Or worse, I guess, they've decided that they really like it. That is where the cultural damage happens, to my mind. Because when the most powerful political figure in the country acts like this is all normal, like cruelty is strength, a lot of people take the cue. Some imitate him directly. Some cheer from the cheap seats. Some look away and say, well, I don't love the way he talks, but, and that but is where the rot gets comfortable. You know, in some ways, that group of people is the one that bothers me the most. But either way, this is how the message becomes clear. You can mock, you can threaten, you can degrade, you can lie, you can turn politics into a revenge machine. And as long as you are hurting the right people, a lot of folks will call it leadership. And that's not just a political problem. That is a character problem with national consequences. Once cruelty gets permission, the next step is turning it into entertainment. And this is one of the ugliest changes in our politics, because cruelty is no longer just something that happens on the way to a policy goal, although there's plenty of that. But in many instances, the cruelty has become the point. It has become the product. It's the show. That is what owning the libs really means. It's not an argument. It's not a philosophy. Certainly not a governing agenda. It's just emotional junk food for people who want to feel powerful without doing anything useful. Someone gets humiliated and the crowd cheers. Someone gets threatened and the crowd says they probably had it coming. Someone gets deported and people share the video, you know, like it's cool. Someone loses a job or loses safety or loses dignity, and or you know, last year someone dies and this response isn't concern, it's applause. That's not politics. That's simply cruelty. And Trump has been one of its most successful salesmen. He understands something dark about attention. He understands that if you give people a target, some of them will confuse their own resentment with righteousness. Targets like immigrants, journalists, disabled people, women, trans people, poor people, black people, Muslims, judges, teachers, librarians, scientists. Pick a week, spin the wheel, somebody gets fed to the crowd. And the crowd knows its part. Laugh, boo, chant, share the clip, buy the t-shirt. Pretend this is all about freedom while demanding that everyone else live under constant threat of punishment from your side. That's quite a trick. Cruelty gets rebranded as courage. Bullying is talked about like it's honesty. Bigotry gets rebranded as, I don't know, common sense, I guess. Basic human decency gets treated like weakness, like some embarrassing little hobby that liberals picked up at a farmer's market. The point is not always to persuade people. Sometimes the point is to just desensitize them. The first time a politician mocks someone vulnerable, some people are shocked, I guess. By the 10th time, far fewer people are shocked. And by the 100th time, the shock has been replaced by a shrug. And after enough shrugs, it just becomes background noise. And I can't overstate how dangerous that is. When cruelty, it becomes entertainment, people stop asking the question, is this right? They just simply say, is this fun? Did it make my side laugh? Did it make the people I don't like angry? Did it feel good for 30 seconds while I scrolled past it on my phone? That, among other things, is a miserable way to run a country. It's also a miserable way to be a person. Because the audience is not innocent here by any stretch. If someone sells cruelty and millions of people keep buying it, we cannot pretend the seller is the only problem. At some point, you have to ask what people are getting out of this. Why does humiliating a stranger feel like a victory? Why does someone else's fear entertain people? Why does a family being separated, or a worker being threatened, or a vulnerable person being manhandled, why does that make anyone feel more free? And this is where the familiar excuses start to rot in your mouth. People who say, I don't like that part, but at some point, I don't like that part, but stops being a moral objection and just becomes like a Yelp review. 4 stars, would prefer slightly less cruelty. Still voting for the cruelty package. Racism has always been very good at changing clothes. That's one of the reasons why it survives generation after generation after generation. It doesn't always show up wearing the same outfit. Sometimes it wears a hood. Sometimes it wears a suit. Sometimes it wears a flag pin. Sometimes it wears a school board smile and says, I'm just concerned about standards. After the civil rights movement, overt racism became less and less socially acceptable in many public spaces. Not gone, not solved, not magically swept out of America, we found the right broom, but less acceptable to say plainly in polite company. So racism adapted. It learned to speak in code. And this is what is meant by the phrase dog whistles. A dog whistle is language that sounds harmless enough to some people, but sends a very specific message to people who know what they are listening for. And of course, these are context dependent, but some examples of these are things like inner city, welfare queen, states' rights, law and order, illegals, DEI hire. They do not share our values. I am just asking questions. That, I am not racist, but, and that last one is always a little warning siren in khakis. Because what follows, I am not racist, but, is almost never something that isn't racist. It's never, I believe deeply in multiracial democracy and equal dignity under the law. It's usually something with, razor wire in it. Dog whistles work because they offer the user plausible deniability. The person using them can say, what? I didn't say anything racist. You're the one making it about race. And that's the trick. The message lands where it was supposed to land, but the speaker has an escape hatch. And for decades, that was a major way racism moved through mainstream politics. It didn't always announce itself. It hinted and it winked. It wore a necktie and asked to be taken seriously. But the Trump era did something very different. It didn't eliminate dog whistles. They're still everywhere. It made a lot of people more comfortable skipping them. Because once the permission structure is strong enough, some people stop bothering with the facade or the code. They just say it. That's why you see all these public racist meltdowns caught on video over and over and over again. In grocery stores and parking lots, on airplanes, restaurants, school meetings, at public counters where some poor employee just came to work hoping the register would function and that nobody would scream racial slurs in their face. And suddenly, here comes a grown adult, red-faced and furious, performing racism in public like it's community theater. The important point is not that racism is new. The important point is that the shame has been weakened. The guardrails have been loosened. The fear of social consequence has been replaced, for some people, by the hope of applause. Because in this political climate, there is a decent chance that if someone gets recorded saying something racist, they will not disappear in shame. They may very well become a hero in certain corners of the internet. They'll almost certainly get defended by some. They might even get called brave. They might get invited into a podcast with a name like, Truth Hammer, Patriot Zone, and spend 40 minutes explaining how they are the real victim because someone filmed them saying the thing they definitely said. That's permission. And it does not only come from Trump. It comes from right-wing media personalities who launder bigotry into concerns. It comes from politicians who pretend racism is just anti-wokeness. It comes from influencers who turn white grievance into content. It comes from ordinary people who hear the dog whistle and say nothing. But Trump has been the big glowing permission slip in the center of the room. He showed people that you can say the ugly thing, get challenged on it, double down, and still be treated as the leader of a major political movement. How can that not matter? Once people see that, the behavior can't help but spread. The permission structure works. The behavior escaped the rally and walked into everyday life. And again, that is the distinction that matters. Racism is not new. The weakening of shame is the story. Now, we can't talk about this subject without talking about political violence. And I'll try to do this carefully because the second you bring this up, some people start sprinting towards false balance like there is a clearance sale on nonsense. So let me be clear. Political violence can come from more than one place. There has been left-wing political violence. There has been violence connected to other ideologies. There have been unstable people who do not fit neatly into anybody's preferred cable news graphic. All of that is true. But it is not the whole truth. And I like to think the whole truth matters. The evidence does not support the right-wing claim that left-wing violence is the main political violence threat in America. It just does not. Researchers at places like the Center for Strategic and International Studies have repeatedly found that over recent decades, right-wing and jihadist violence have been far, far more lethal than left-wing terrorism. Even though that same organization, CSIS, also reported that left-wing attacks and plots rose in 2025 from historically low levels. The Anti-Defamation League reported that all extremist-related murders in the United States in 2024 were committed by right-wing extremists. So this is not everybody is equally bad. Please pass the mashed potatoes. That is not the analysis. Claiming that is just fog. And fog is very useful when people do not want you to see the road. The reality is that political violence does not usually begin with someone throwing a punch or picking up a weapon. It begins much earlier. It begins with language. It begins when opponents stop being opponents and start being enemies. When opponents start being called traitors or invaders or vermin or criminals. And once you convince people that their neighbors are not just wrong, but they're evil or corrupt, dangerous, destroying the country, you are playing with matches in a room full of gasoline. That does not mean every person who hears that language will become violent. Of course not. The vast majority of them don't. But some hear it differently. Some hear that rhetoric as permission. Some take it as a mission. Some hear the phrase, someone needs to do something. And if the most powerful voices in their political world keep saying that the courts are corrupt and the election workers are criminals and the prosecutors are villains and the press is the enemy, immigrants are invading, Democrats are destroying America, eventually one or more than one of those people was going to decide that the speech was not just a speech, it was instructions. That's why this matters. That's why it matters when judges get called traitors. That's why it matters when election workers get smeared, when public officials are targeted by name. That's why it matters when the people who attacked the Capitol on January 6th are treated not as criminals, but as heroes, or hostages, or political prisoners, or misunderstood patriots who just happened to bring zip ties and bear spray to a tourist visit. Come on. At some point, we have to stop pretending the match is shocked by the fire. And again, this is where MAGA likes to hide behind the majority. Most Trump supporters are not violent. Correct. That is correct. Most are not. But movements do not need everyone to commit violence. They need a small number willing to act. And they need a much larger number willing to justify it or excuse it or minimize it or just laugh it off or just change the subject or just say, yeah, I don't like that, but that is the permission structure. The violent person may be the one who crosses the line, but they often cross it years after watching other people move the line closer and closer and closer. And if you keep calling people enemies and traitors and invaders, you do not get to act confused when somebody eventually decides those words are meant to be a plan. And that brings us to the permission givers. Because this is the part that people don't like. It's easier to talk about the leaders. It's easier to talk about Trump or the loudest voices in the government. It's easier to talk about the guy screaming at the school board or the person yelling slurs at a cashier or the keyboard warrior with, the eagle emoji. These people are the ones that are visible. They are loud. They are easy to point at. But movements like this are not sustained only by the loudest people. They are sustained by the people who make excuses for them. There are really three groups here. There are the leaders who model the behavior. There are the emulators who copy the behavior. And then there are the multitudes of permission givers who excuse the behavior. That third group is the largest. These are the people who say, whether out loud or by their silence, I wish he would not say it, but I do not like name calling, but I think he goes too far sometimes, but I don't agree with everything he does, but. And listen, I understand compromise. Politics is full of compromise. Not everybody gets a candidate who agrees with them on every issue. If you're waiting for the perfect politician, pack a lunch and bring a folding chair because you're going to be there for a while. But there is a difference between compromise and surrender, particularly when it's surrendering your standards. There's a difference between saying, I disagree with this policy, but I support the broader agenda on one side, and on the other side saying, I know he dehumanizes people and he lies constantly and he threatens democratic institutions, and I realize that he spreads conspiracies and mocks the vulnerable and surrounds himself with people who treat cruelty like a campaign strategy. But, he did close the border, so here we are. That's not a policy trade-off. That's moral laundering. It takes something ugly, runs it through partisanship, and hands it back looking almost respectable if you squint real hard and the lights are dim. And this is where I want to be very, very clear. I'm not saying every Trump supporter is violent, racist, or cruel. I'm saying a whole lot of people decided that violence, racism, and cruelty are no longer deal breakers. That is not a small distinction. That is the entire ball game. If racism is not a deal breaker, then racism has permission. If threats are not a deal breaker, then threats have permission. If mocking vulnerable people isn't a deal breaker, then mockery has permission. If authoritarian language is not a deal breaker, then authoritarianism has room to breathe. You do not have to do the thing to give the thing permission. Sometimes permission is a shrug. Sometimes permission is a laugh. Sometimes permission is the vote. Sometimes permission is the silence. Sometimes it's pretending you did not hear exactly what you heard, because admitting it would require you to change something. And if by some miracle you are a MAGA listener who downloads this podcast and has actually made it this far in this episode, first of all, welcome. I'm guessing your phone might have accidentally autoplayed this while you were trying to find a video about how windmills cause socialism. But seriously, if you've made it this far, ask yourself one question. If your political opponent behaved exactly this way, would you excuse it? For all the negative things that people say about Barack Obama, if he had called judges traitors, if he had mocked disabled people, encouraged rage at election workers, lied about losing an election, praised his violent supporters, talked about immigrants like vermin, spent years being cruel and turning it into entertainment, would you say, well, I don't love the tone, but of course you wouldn't. You would treat it as proof of a moral collapse. So maybe the standard is not the behavior. Maybe the standard is the jersey. And once that happens, you're not defending values anymore. You're defending a team. That's how lines move. Not all at once. Just one excuse at a time. So when people ask me why I dislike Donald Trump so much, this is the major part of the answer. Certainly not the only part, but a big one. It's not because I think he's the first dishonest politician. It's not because I think he's the first vain, petty, insecure man to wander into public life and mistake attention for respect. Please. American politics have had plenty of peacocks with microphones. It's not because I think every bad thing in America began with him. It did not. The ugliness was here. The racism was here. The cruelty was here. Conspiracies, the appetite for domination. It's just that Trump gave all of this stuff permission. He made it louder. He made it safer. He made it profitable. He made it entertaining. And maybe the most damaging of all, he convinced millions of people that objecting to it was optional. That's not a small thing. Presidents leave office. Laws can be repealed. Policies get rewritten. Budgets change. Court rulings can be overturned or shift. But culture is a lot harder to repair. Once people have learned that cruelty gets applause, it's really hard to teach them shame again. Once people have learned that racism can be defended as just asking questions, it's really hard to rebuild honesty. Once people have learned that threats can be dismissed as passion, it's hard to rebuild accountability. Once people have learned that decency is weakness and domination signals strength, it's hard to get them, back to anything that resembles actual citizenship. The line does not move all at once. It moves one excuse at a time. One laugh, one shrug, one, oh, that's not what he meant. One, come on, it's just a joke. One, both sides are bad. One, I really don't like that part, but until behavior that once would have shocked people becomes just another Tuesday. And that is why this matters beyond just one man, because the real danger of permission is not just that it changes what people do. It changes what people defend. It changes what they excuse. It changes what they teach their children to defend and excuse or ignore. It changes what society is willing to call normal. And once cruelty gets normalized, decency, it starts to feel like rebellion. So be rebellious. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time on this Monday to download and listen to this episode from Your Neighbor on the Left. I appreciate it more than you know. I would love to hear your thoughts on this subject, or any subject for that matter. If you go to the website, neighborontheleft.com, you'll find, among other things, a contacts page where you can use social media to send DMs, or you can use the email address to reach out that way. And I would love to hear from you. While you're on the website, you can also check out the episodes page, where you can stream or download any episode of the podcast going all the way back to the beginning. And of course, as always, there's the blog section, and those posts mirror the subjects from the podcast, and they include all of my sources. We'll be back on Wednesday with another episode of Your Neighbor on the Left. So between now and then, stay engaged, stay kind, and have the kind of week you'd wish for others.